I'm going to talk you through the content we're covering in this week's assignment. This covers Key Area 3.1 of National 5 Biology. You should see the summary notes on your screen. These are available in the Files section of the General thread. The first Key Area 3.1 is closely related to 3.4. So that's why we tend to cover these two sections in the one booklet at school. This week we're looking at Key Area 3.1 only. The first thing to say about this topic that you'll notice is it has a lot of definitions to learn. The benefit of this topic is that there are some of these definitions that you're bound to have met in everyday life and know from general knowledge already. The first set here starts with habitat, which is simply the place where an organism lives. The next one's population, which is the total number of living things of one type living in a habitat. If you think about the discussion of the population of Scotland, and we say it's around about 5.5 million, everyone assumes from that we're talking about people, which we are, and that's a good way to help you remember population is the number of one type of living organism. In exam questions, they quite often use the example of the red deer population in Scotland, which would be the number of red deer in Scotland. The community is all the living organisms of all types. So there you're looking at your grass, worms, cows, humans, dogs, snails, trees, everything that lives there. The last one, ecosystem. If you were answering an exam question that said, what is an ecosystem? You can say ecosystem equals habitat plus community. So that is the place plus absolutely everything that lives there. If you are learning this topic though, remember to know the definitions of what habitat and community are. When you are doing an exam question, they will use the full description of ecosystem. The next one is species. Organisms defined as being the same species if they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. What this means is they can have babies with each other and produce babies who can also then go on to have their own offspring. You might remember in the classroom there's a picture of the liger. It's there to illustrate the term species. Sometimes you can get organisms who can breed together and they're not the same species because their offspring are infertile, and the liger is a good example of this. If you have a liger, it is a cross between a tiger and a lion, and if you want another liger, you would have to get another tiger and a lion to breed. You wouldn't be able to breed two ligers together. They're infertile. The next term is biodiversity, which comes from two biology words, bio, as in biology, living things, and diversity, differences. So it's the range of different living things in a particular area is the biodiversity. So if you had high biodiversity, you'd have lots of different species there, and low biodiversity, there might just be one or two species. The next section looks at how we describe different individuals by how they get their food. So producers are green plants. If you have a green plant, it makes its own food by photosynthesis. If you have something you think is a plant but has no green parts on it at all, it's not a producer. The producer could also be something green like plankton living in water, which also makes its own food. So you get single-celled producers and big, huge producers like trees. Consumers are any animals which have to consume or eat other organisms. The reason why we prefer the term consume is obviously if you've got a little animal cell which gets its food in by diffusion of glucose or dissolved sugars into its cell membrane, we wouldn't say that it was eating. So consuming. A consumer can't make its own food. When we're looking at the food chains next week, we'll be using some of these words, but we'll have a little bit of a look at them just now. Primary consumers are animals which eat green plants, just like primary school is your first school. Secondary school, your second school, so secondary consumers, the second one in terms of consumers in a chain. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers, so they are carnivores. Carnivores are animals which eat other animals for food. The third category you can get, apart from producers and consumers, start that bit again. This is, if you're looking at herbivores, only eat plants, carnivores only eat meat, omnivores are organisms which eat both plants and animals. And your examples of omnivores could be humans or pigs. Example of carnivores, any of the cats, herbivores, sheep. The last bit of this subsection, animals that hunt other animals for food are called predators, and the hunted animals are the prey. So if you've got a fox going after a rabbit, the fox is the predator and the rabbit is the prey. The next term, niche, is one which is worth memorising off by heart. The description here, a niche is the role an organism plays within a community, is the one that I personally use. However, you'll see in the PowerPoint, it has an alternative saying a niche is the role an organism plays in an ecosystem. Either is fine. I tend to go with community, but the important thing is to memorise it off by heart because it's quite difficult to describe. One of the additions to the National 5 course was a lot more description about niches. And the niche, the role an organism plays in its community, can depend on a variety of things, and here are some of them here. What resources are available? So that could be food or places to build a nest if it's birds, that sort of thing. Temperature and pH conditions, competition and predators, so they're going to compete for food and nesting sites, they're going to be trying to get away from predators if they're prey, and then interactions with other members of the community. The PowerPoint goes into this in some detail, so have a look at that. Here's an example of a robin and a whole pile of details about how we would determine its niche. You will never be asked to give all this kind of detail. You'll always just be asked what is a niche and maybe be expected to recognise them in a multiple choice. I'll give an example later. So here's the robin. It eats fruits and seeds and small insects. It can survive in temperatures between 0 and 20 degrees C, and it's in competition with other small birds, including robins, for food, but it's also a prey animal for cats, dogs, foxes and raccoons. That'll be coming from an American site, presumably we don't have many raccoons here. And its interactions, it's going to be looking for nests and maybe competing with other species for nesting sites. This part here, food chains, is the start of what we're looking at next week, so I'm going to scroll past that. That really fits in with Key Area 4, which is very related to this one, which is why we do them together. Come down to the last part here, competition. So animals or plants will be in competition with each other when there's short supply of resources. So if it's very dry, if there's not much food, that sort of thing. And it's very important to memorise the things that plants compete for. And you can do it as a list, just memorise them and use the words from the list. So plants are competing for light. Imagine plants that are very crammed in together and overcrowded. Some leaves of some plants will be overshadowing other leaves, and the underneath leaf won't get enough light to do photosynthesis. Similarly, if the plants are all very crowded in, the roots are all going to be round about the same place, and if there's a limited supply of water, not all the plants will get it. The soil nutrients also come up with the water, so they'll be affected too, but stick to things from the list. When you look at animals, again, stick to the list. So I would go with food, shelter, territory, mates, or water. One of the mistakes pupils made in the past was there used to be quite often a question about what do squirrels compete for? And people were like, oh, they're competing for nuts. Don't assume that you know what the food the animal eats is. You have to stick to the list, so go with food. So it doesn't matter what animal they ask you, what's it competing for? It's competing for food. When we look at competition between animals, or between plants as well, but we tend to think of it as with animal examples, there are two types. Intraspecific is competition between members of the same species. They all need the same resources, and this makes their competition very intense. Here's an example of two cobras that are fighting over a mouse. If it's the same species, they need identical resources. So if they're in short supply, it's going to be quite intensive. Interspecific, on the other hand, is competition between members of the different species. And they're still competing for resources that they require, but not necessarily every single resource being identical. And this type of competition, therefore, is less intense. And here's a couple of birds of different types, a pigeon and a duck, competing for bread. You don't need to know some examples. Here's a handy way to remember it. Intraspecific, same species, and interspecific, different species. These are one of the most commonly mixed up parts of the course when you've got similar words, so maybe making a note of that would be very helpful. That's the end of our first section, and this goes along with the PowerPoint and other work that's in your assignment for this week. The assignment comes out in two parts. There's an assessment. Make sure that you complete the assessment and send it back by Teams.